Today, we are talking about the 6th generation of consoles, which was an interesting and innovative time. Really, we had stuff coming from that generation that we still use and love today in gaming, and other things that we downright hated. In fact, there's one aspect to Microsoft when they first showed up that people couldn't stand, and that's what we're going to be looking at here in this video. I remember the hype for Microsoft and their new Xbox console leading up to launch towards the tail end of 2001. Bill Gates and The Rock introducing the black and green box, Halo blowing our teenage minds, and that iconic startup sound. It was the best of times, at least according to my fuzzy, nostalgia-driven child brain memories, where I wasn't aware of much going on outside the walls of my house and my immediate friend circles. However, there was one major hang-up with a system that felt like some advanced alien technology on release. That's the thing you need to use to actually play the games. That's right, today we're talking about the Duke controller and how back then I felt like I was the only one who actually liked the thing. Which, yes, spoiler, I'm a Duke person. So if you're unaware, this is the original Xbox controller, the OG. It's not the S-type controller you see floating around now in images of everyone having fun playing Halo 2. This was the big boy or the fatty, according to press at the time. There really wasn't much competition here. This was by far the biggest controller to come with a console at the time. There's information going around that in 2008, the Duke set a Guinness World Record as the largest controller in gaming history. However, when I went looking for the entry in the Gamer's 2008 edition that's cited, I only find the Xbox console getting the record for the largest. So they do talk about how heavily criticized the Duke was, but no awards that I was able to find. Either way, it would have been beaten easily by apparently this Oppo Gamepad C1 that's larger than a person, so it just edges out the Duke barely. I picked this one up from eBay and it's in okay shape, but could use a good cleaning, so I figured I'd break it down and do a mild refurbishing job and get it back to a like-new condition by the end of this video. The Xbox controller still has a lot of standard features and a layout that has persisted throughout the generations. A couple of offset thumbsticks, colored A, B, X, and Y face buttons, an OK D-pad, start, back, 2 triggers, and the black and white buttons. No shoulder buttons, and in fact, those black and white buttons would take up for the lack of extra shoulder buttons in third-party games at times. Unfortunately, these 2 buttons only highlighted just how large the controller was. Since they're so far out of the way, you would really need to reach when it was time to turn on a flashlight or change grenade types. There are expansion bays at the top of the controller that, to me, are clear takeaways from what Sega was doing with the Dreamcast. Sure, there's no screen like a VMU that would go here, but the placement and the functionality with something like a memory card always reminded me of Sega's final console. I mentioned the thumbsticks earlier, and initially Microsoft had 2 different tops, with the left stick having a standard size indent for your thumb, but the right stick was smaller and resembled almost a crosshair design. The right stick is generally used for looking around in games and aiming or swinging a camera, and while it makes sense thinking about it that way, I guess it didn't land with everyone since it was removed when the S-Type was introduced a couple of years later. One major advantage the Duke had to start the generation were the triggers. These still hold up to this day. If you look at your Xbox 360, One, or Xbox Series controller, you'll notice the concept really hasn't changed much. They're responsive, have good kickback, perfect tension, and give you the extra feedback you would want for shooting and racing games. The position underneath the controller also made it feel unique compared to Nintendo and Sony, who both used their back shoulder buttons as straight up and down presses. At least the GameCube had analog buttons though. This was something that plagued Sony the entire generation in racing games, and it wasn't until the PS3 that they were able to fully fix it. Oh, and leave it to Microsoft to innovate on the wired controller in the shortest and last generation that used them. At the end of the cable, you of course have the end that plugs into the console, but just before that on the Xbox cord is another connection. This is called the breakaway cable. It could keep your console from being pulled down off a high spot like a dresser if someone ran through the room and the cord draped across it. Instead, that second connection would pull apart, keeping your system in place and your controller in your hands. It was a pretty clever design, but wasn't really needed much in the following generation since we moved to wireless controllers. It was still a concept for the Xbox 360 with any of those wired controllers, but this would have been an awesome thing to have back starting with the original Nintendo, since I'm sure everyone out there has a horror story of holding their breath as someone trips over a controller cord. I always liked the big Xbox jewel right there in the center. The entire shape of the controller sloped down from the X logo, which ended up making the thing too uncomfortable for the majority of gamers. This led to this thing getting mercilessly roasted back then. Game Informer gave it the Blunder of the Year award in their January 2002 issue, saying Microsoft claims to have received an input from thousands of gamers and industry insiders when designing the controller for its next-gen console. Too bad it didn't listen to any of them or us, feeling much like a third-pound burger with all the fixins. This controller may be the biggest, no pun intended, hurdle in the way of Xbox's success. You know things are bad when we're surprised anytime this contraption handles well while playing a game. Good thing Mad Catz made a hands-friendly third-party controller. Well, you know it's bad when Mad Catz is being recommended over you. Imagine going to a friend's house back in the day, and they take the weird-looking third-party controller and make you use the official one. Seamus Blackley even mentioned in a recent interview that people threw things at him on stage because of that Duke controller. I found some old forum posts from 2001, and it seemed like the Xbox console itself was already facing a lot of skepticism, so it was starting behind the 8-ball right away, and the pack-in controller was basically them scratching. On the back, there's a few Phillips head screws keeping it together, and once removed, the two halves split apart. I will say this is certainly the easiest controller to disassemble from this generation. There's really not much left to do here with a few screws holding down the board and rumble motors. The whole thing just lifts up and away. The D-pad is pretty weird though, and you can sort of see why it's what I would call an extra mushy D-pad. There are these extra rubber pieces here in each corner that would usually be used for pressing a connection on the board, but in this case, they just seem to offer support for up, down, left, and right. A larger pivot point in the middle would have been a better method, and they did away with this strange setup for the following generation. Cleaning up a controller like this is pretty straightforward. Just get a container with some soap and water along with a brush, and that's basically it. Just scrub each piece as best as you can and rinse it off afterwards. I usually leave the plastic pieces out to dry for a few hours before reassembly. For 99% of secondhand controllers, soap and water will get the job done, and there's really no need to overthink things here. I was fortunate with this controller that both joysticks are in good condition with no obvious drifting, and each had good tension resetting to the center. After getting the Duke controller back together and playing a couple of games with it in much better condition, reality set in. This is just not a controller that stood the test of time. Sure, technology in general has improved, but even with that in mind, it's pretty clear Microsoft missed big time with the ergonomics and button placement here. I have a lot more experience using a wider range of controllers now, and the power of hindsight, realizing that a lot of my love for this controller is driven from nostalgia of a time where I was none the wiser. I guess I was going between this and the GameCube controller a lot, so it's not as if I had what would be considered a normal looking controller compared to the more modern counterparts from Microsoft and Nintendo. Either way, there's really no recommending this monster controller over the S-Type, which solved a lot of complaints from the launch Duke model and just turned in an overall more comfortable controller for what would end up being a necessity with hours and hours on end of Halo 2 in a single night. So I get why the original Xbox controller was and still is hated so much, but maybe it's remembering a time before the crazy social media vortex where you discover a console that felt like it could do anything without a person being there through your phone to randomly tell you why you were wrong. When I look at the Xbox Duke controller, I actually think about one of those kiosks that places like Kmart would have on display, and the first game I remember seeing was Munch's Odyssey, and it absolutely blew me away with how amazing it looked visually. It was only a matter of time before I went over to a friend's house who got an Xbox with Halo, and the rest is history. In truth, this was the first controller I used from Microsoft for their push into the console gaming space, and what a legendary time for the green brand this was. So for that, I have to give it to Duke controller. Even if it really is the size of a double quarter pounder, at least it helped Microsoft learn what not to do as they went on to make arguably one of the greatest controllers of all time. Let me know if you have any memories of the Duke controller or even the launch of the original Xbox back in 2001. Hard to believe next year, this system and brand will turn 25, so hopefully Microsoft has some fun plans in mind for the anniversary.